It's time to stitch the first block on our Autumn Acres bench pillow. The apple tree is on page 11. I have my background fabric and my other fabrics backed with interfacing. The grass has been interfaced with the lightweight non-woven, and I was going to interface the tree trunk with the lightweight non-woven, but mixed up the brown fabrics. So this has regular woven interfacing. And from the embellishment kit, I have the felt. I also have cut my batting, and I am starting to tack my batting down, which is a little bit different than I have done in the years past. So my batting is cut just a little bit larger. What I do for my batting is I use Warm and Natural. I get large, maybe full size or sometimes even queen size pieces of batting, and then I will cut strips of the width I need and then cut them to size. So for this project, there are only 2 sizes of battings for the main blocks in the quilt. So the first and last will have a 5-inch piece that I'm cutting because I'm going to trim it down to 4 by 8. So I have cut the batting 5 by 9, just an inch larger. And so the strip that I cut from my piece of batting is a 5-inch strip, and it's just folded. This is all one long strip that I will just cut to size when I need a 4-inch piece of batting for a project so that I can tack it down and trim it. Now again, before I used to cut my batting exactly to size, and sometimes I still do, but in those cases I would cut, for example, a strip of 4-inch because Kimberbell uses a lot of 4-inch sizes of battings, and then I would cut whatever size I needed for that 4-inch piece of batting. Now I did the same thing with the main blocks that are the larger size blocks. I need a 6 by 8 piece as a finished size. That's after tacking down and trimming. So I have cut my strip to 7 inches wide, and then I will just cut the piece to length when I get to a larger block. So that's how I'm doing the batting for this project. I will note that that will not be the case when I do borders. I always cut my batting to size when I do borders, and I'll talk more of that when I'm actually stitching the borders out. But let's start our first block, the apple tree. Also for this project, I am going to be using muslin as my stabilizer. So how I cut my muslin is similar to how I cut my batting. I will take the width of the fabric, and I try to buy either 90 or 120 inch width of fabric for my muslin. And so I have one long strip, and I cut, of course, different sizes for my different hoops. So for this project, I am going to be using, for the main blocks, either my 9 by 14, because I can fit one of the smaller blocks that I'm doing that will be on each end of the quilt, or I might go down to my 9.5 by 9.5 for the larger blocks. And then what I like to do is rotate the block so that it fits sideways, and I'll show that at the machine. But you can choose a hoop that's closer to the actual size of the block. But how I hoop my muslin is I will put the end of the muslin towards me or towards the bottom of my hoop, and I have the excess strip hanging off the top so that that will just kind of fall to the back of my machine and off my table. And this isn't really heavy, so it doesn't cause an issue with the design stitching out. However, you could fold this, nice and maybe clip it, but I feel that that might add more weight, so I just let this strip fall off to the back. And then when I am stitching, I will situate my design, how I want to stitch it out, and then I will move it all the way down. And that is so that I can save anything above it because I am using a larger hoop. So let's go to the machine. I am doing all of this first block right at the machine, adding both the background quilting and the design. From now on, I am going to merge the designs, or after this block, I'm going to merge the design with the background quilting in software and do all my adjustments, because we have to make some adjustments to the blocks before we stitch them out. So let's get to the machine and start stitching our first block. So I have my USB open, and before I show you how I organize my USB, I do want to make a note, since this is a new project, that while I can add designs right to my machine and pull them up, I work on so many different projects that I don't kind of like to jam my machine up with a bunch of random designs from a bunch of different projects. And so I love USBs, but I do not plug my USBs directly into my machine. Again, because I do so many, I just feel that it has the potential to add more wear and tear putting those USBs in and out of my machine. So I have a cord, I call it a pigtail cord. It's just a cord that fits into my USB on my machine, and then I plug my USB into the cord. This cord never gets unplugged from my machine unless it goes in for service, and so I don't have that wear and tear on the port, because that would be very expensive, I assume, if something happened to that. If the use of this cord, something happens while I'm using this, I just have a cord to replace. So I have my USB plugged in, and I have opened it, and you'll notice 3 folders. Now I'm going to go over more about this combined files folder when I start with the software that I use to combine files. That's where I will put them. So right now that's just empty. But on my USB, I have my quilting bundle that I purchased, and I have my embroidery files. And so I have those separated so they're easy to find. And for this first block, I am going to, again, just do everything with those individual files. I need to first open the quilting bundle folder, and this block takes the Fruit 14 block by block, and I need the 4 by 8. I will select, hit set, and now I need to add the file. So I will go to add, back to my USB, and go to my embroidery files folder and choose the little tree. I will select that and hit set. For all of the main blocks of this project, there are special alignment instructions, and that is because this is kind of like a street scene, and so there's grass and there's a car, there's houses, and they need to be shifted so that they look like they're sitting on a street. And so in the directions, it talks about how to align the design with the background quilting. And so it's important to always pay attention. These should all be the same, and it shows right here in the block by block quilting. There are special alignments. So it says to align the embroidery file, which is the tree, with the bottom of the quilting file. And it gives a little picture, and so if you notice on the tree file, there is a little line, and it has kind of a little tick mark that just shows the center, and I need to line that up with the bottom outside of the quilting. So let me zoom in and show you how to do that. The first thing, I'm going to go to edit and move so that I don't get this out of alignment left and right. I could use my finger to drag it down, but then it might get out of alignment again left to right. So I'm going to use the arrows. And so I've just gone to edit, move, and then I'll be using these arrows, but I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. Now you can see that this square that you can see kind of in the middle of the background quilting is around the actual tree file. So here's the bottom with that little tick mark, and I need that line to be even with this outside orange border of the background quilting. So using my arrows, I am going to just move it down. Now, because I brought the tree in last, or the most recent, that is selected by default, so I can just move it down and that's already selected. And so there is that inner box, but I want to keep going and move that to line up with the bottom. Now, this inner box of the background quilting will actually be where the seams are to sew the blocks together. And so you can see that this grass piece is going to be inside the seam allowance, and that's fine. That's how they want it, so it looks like, you know, it's grounded. And so I need to make sure that that's lined up, and that is how my block will be stitched. Now, once I have that done, I can select OK because I'm finished with that. And I am going to choose embroidery. And that will combine. So now if I move these, they will move as one design, which is what I want. Because I've aligned them, I don't want them to move, you know, separately. But now I need to go change my hoop because I am stitching on my large hoop. So I'm going to go to settings, and I am going to choose my 9.5 by 14. I will select OK. Now I am going to increase my speed because the last time I used it, I was, I think, using metallic, and so it was at the lowest. And I will select OK. And now I need to take advantage of my larger hoop. I, of course, wouldn't want to stitch like this because that would be a waste and there'd be no point in stitching with the large hoop. So I am going to go to Layout and Rotate. I'm going to rotate this to the left 90 degrees. And then I need to shift this all the way down. Now I kind of moved that when I was showing that it moved together. I'm going to recenter that so it's got the same space on each. And then I'm going to move it down. And it will stop at the end so I can get as close as my machine will let me. And now I'm ready to stitch. And so you can see that I have all this room that I can use for another block. So I will select OK, and I like to stitch on this minus plus needle screen. I can move forward or backward steps or stitches, and I will need to do that stitching with these individual designs that I brought in. I do need to skip some steps. And of course the stitches, if my thread breaks or you know, something like that, I can rethread and then move back to kind of go over those where I had to cut, and that's where the stitches come in handy. All right, so my first step is to stitch the placement of the batting. Now I just picked one of the brown threads. I am going to be using this tack down of the batting that I'm about to do for some of the block to trim the batting at the end, and I'll go over more about that later. But of course you don't have to put in brown. If you can see linen, which is going to be the background quilting, if you're following the directions, you can just put linen in and not have to change the thread. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my larger piece of batting, and I'm going to just make sure that it is over my lines so that it can tack down, and I will tack that down. Now I just mentioned something about using the dark thread to help me trim my batting at the end, but for this first block I have decided just to do it the regular traditional way for the entire thing. So I've tacked my batting down, and I need to trim right next to that tack down around the entire block. After trimming my batting, the next step is to run the placement for the fabric. Now the placement stitch is just 1/4 of an inch outside of the batting, and so I don't run this step because I just don't feel it's necessary because our fabric is so much larger. However, you can run all of the steps, but I am going to go ahead and skip by using my down arrow. And the next step will be the tack down of the fabric, and I do need that. But first I need to place my fabric. So I have my batting trimmed. I have the back of my fabric sprayed with a little bit of spray adhesive. And again, you can see how much overlap there is with our fabric, and that placement would only be to about right here. So I, again, just feel that that is really not necessary. As long as I take this fabric, again, you can see how much overlap there is, and just generally place it, then I am good to go. I like to fold back and make sure that I'm about even. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I will usually fold back for the top and the bottom to make sure that I have a little bit, and I am ready to go. Now I need to go ahead and run the tack down. The next step is to run the background quilting. After stitching the background quilting, I need to skip some more steps. Now, the next step is this little placement line with that little tick mark that we lined up with the outside of the background quilting when we shifted that little tree down. I do not need to stitch that, so I'm going to use my down arrow to skip. And then it has a tack down box around the tree design, and because we're doing block by block quilting, we have already tacked our fabric down. I do not need this. In fact, it would ruin my block if I would stitch this. This would come in handy if you were stitching this design on something else or not using block by block quilting. It would show you where your design is. So I need to skip this as well. And now we'll start on the block. And the first step is going to be a placement line for our little piece of grass. I'm going to run the placement line. I'll place my little grass piece of fabric. I will spray it with a little bit of adhesive, and then I will tack it down and trim. I didn't get a video of that, but it was simply just placing the fabric down and tacking it down. Now remember, this piece I left longer when I added the interfacing to the back. I didn't go back and cut these to the size. Remember I said there would be, you know, 1/2 inch or 1 inch left over, and it was either cutting it down, taking the time when I was prepping the fabric, or just doing that now. And that's why this piece is so much larger. So now I need to go ahead and trim all the way around this little grass. And then after I trim, it's going to run a little decorative stitch just about, I don't know, maybe 1/4 of the way on this left side. And that's because the tree will end up covering, you know, the other portion. Actually, it's probably about half of that it will do a decorative stitch. But it will just be on the top, because remember, this bottom piece is going to be sewn into the seam allowance. All right, so let's do that decorative stitch. After running the placement for the tree, placing my fabric and tacking it down, I need to go ahead and trim around this tree. And this would have been a really good applique to use the scan and cut, if you use the scan and cut, and I'll be showing that a little bit later. So now I will just trim right next to this tree, and remember, I think I just cut some of the threads. This side of the trunk and the bottom of the grass will be in the seam allowance. The tree looks really good. Now that satin stitching for all the tree took 14 minutes on my highest speed. So that was a lot of stitching. It looks really good. Then the next step was the placement for all of these cute little leaves that are going to be in felt. Now the directions call for taking the piece of felt. Remember, I didn't cut mine down at all. So I think that this would be cut down even a little bit more. But the directions say to place your felt, you know, covering all those placements, tack it down, and then trim the leaves. The leaves are going to be raw edge applique, and there's no other stitching after you trim it. I can't do that. And so how I work with my embellishments, or sometimes even my fabric, when I have very spaced out designs that will be stitched at the same time or in the same step, is I just start and stop my machine. Now this is totally not what most people do, and you definitely don't have to do this, but I want to show you how I do it. So it started with the placement down. It did, you know, all of these, and then it came back to the very beginning. So we're going to go through the same sequence. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, for example, it's going to stitch this one out. I am going to place my felt. Now I do need to make sure I leave, you know, a little bit of room to trim. I don't want to, you know, place it too close. And so I will probably just place it like this in the corner. I will tack it down, and when my machine cuts and gets ready to move to this leaf, I am going to just manually stop my machine. It will move because it's cut, the thread's cut, and it will jump to this next leaf, but it will stop. Then I'm just going to loosely trim this. I'll take my felt. These two are stitched and they're pretty close. I'm not that crazy, but I'll then cover both of those with another piece. I will let it stitch both those. I will stop my machine after it cuts the second. It will move to this one, and I will just keep doing that. These two, of course, will be done at the same time, and then it will finish up with this one. Again, this is not something that you have to do. It's what most people probably don't do, but I'm going to do it because I like to save material. All right, so let's get these leaves stitched. So you can see how I did that, and I have barely used any. Again, that is not necessary, but I just, that's just what I do, because now I have this whole piece. Now again, this part of this is going to be used somewhere else, but then I have a bunch of green felt that I can use for another project. Now for these leaves, that is the only stitching that will be done with these leaves, and so I need to just trim about 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch, just not right next to them, so that the stitching doesn't get cut because there's, again, no other stitching that will go around these. So I will just take my smaller scissors and just cut so that there's a little bit around that stitching. The next step is going to do a little stem detail on that leaf that is falling, and then the next several steps are just going to be the embroidery leaves. And so we've got some orange thread, kind of a plum color, and back to the orange for some details, and some apple stem details. So I'm going to run through all of that embroidery, and then we have some special instructions coming up. I just got done stitching all of these leaves that is supposed to be in the wild plum color. Now I did not have that color, and I thought that would have been a good color to have, and my quilt shop was out of it, so I needed to just pick a different color. You can see that these look like brown leaves. They almost look the same color, just slightly darker than the tree, even though the color looks plum in person or like on the spool. It looks too similar to the tree. So I decided to use the maroon thread. It's just called Maroon, and I stitched this first leaf again in maroon. And I'm not sure if it really shows up on video. In person I can tell a big difference. This has some you know, plums or kind of the reddish tint that these do not. Again, I'm not really sure you can see that on video, but in person, this is much different. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep restitching these out, and then it does one little stem on here. I went ahead and stopped my machine with this color just because it's just, you know, a stem like this one, and so I just will do that with this maroon color. All right, so I'm going to restitch those so it'll look a little bit different, and then I'll keep going. So I'm done stitching the leaves and the little apple stems, which was just what it stitched, and I have some jump stitches to cut. There's, you know, a handful between the leaves, and so I am going to go ahead and cut those now. And I will put this in better light, but I love this maroon much better. I think that is closer to, you know, what it's supposed to look like, kind of leaves changing. So I will trim these, and then we have some special instructions. These little scissors are called side hoppers, and they have a little bend, and you pinch them and they just you know, can go under the little jump stitch and trim. So that's what I use for the most part when I trim jump stitches. Now the next step is going to be optional if you are not using the embellishment kit. So actually the next several steps. So the next step says if you plan to attach the apple button, then you would skip this step because it looks like the little stem. The button, of course, has a little stem and a leaf, and so there will be a few things that we need to skip. So I am going to skip that because I have the embellishment kit. But of course, again, this is always nice that if you use your embellishment kit and want to do this block again for whatever reason, they give you all the elements to stitch it out. So if I come up to my machine, that next step is that little stem. I am going to skip that, so I will just use my down arrow. And then it is going to do some stitches for the hanging or embroidered apples, and then I do need to stitch those because this little apple down here is the only button. There's 3 apples that will be stitched, and of course I need to stitch the stem and the leaves and then the apple. So I will stitch these 3, and then I'll just basically repeat that. So this is the step that I just skipped. Now it is on these hanging apples that I do need to stitch. Then the next step comes back down to this little bottom apple, and it is the leaf, and so I will skip that step, then stitch the leaves that are in the tree. I'll come back and skip the next step, which is another leaf, or the fill part of that apple that will be a button. I will skip. I will stitch the apples that are in the tree, and then finally I will skip stitching the apple because I have my button. So it's just going to go from skipping to stitching, skipping, stitching, skipping, stitching, and skipping if you're using the button in the embellishment kit. Now the next step, I'm back to this little apple that will be the button, and so I need to skip. I will use my down arrow, and then I will stitch these 3 for the tree. The next step goes back to this little apple. It's part of the leaf, so I need to skip that. And now I'm going to stitch all of the apples that are in the tree. Now the last step is stitching the apple on the bottom if you're not using the button, but I am done, and so I can just go home. It'll ask me if I want to cancel, and I am done with my block. Let's go take a look. I'm done with the first block, and it looks really good. Now I am glad that I changed to that maroon thread for these dark leaves. I'm not really sure that it shows up great on video. In person, I can tell that it has a little bit more of that maroon color and doesn't look quite as brown. It is still darker than probably the called for thread, but again, my shop was out of it. So I'm happy with that, and I think it looks great. Now, the next block I do is going to be in the same hooping. So right now, I am not going to take this out of the hoop. Again, I'm using my larger hoop to save on stabilizer. So the next video will show you how I do that. But for now, I'm going to leave this block and I will trim this down a little bit later. All right, let's move on to our second block.